commodity sourcing and stressed the need for stronger education for the public about farming and where the food that lands on our tables comes from. I heard from constituents in Prosser and Benton and Yakima counties who stressed the importance of agricultural research, from producers in Quincy who shared their personal stories of the impacts of crop insurance on their livelihoods, and from farmers in Othello who raised concerns regarding regulatory burdens on the agricultural community. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to rise today to say that this Farm Bill makes great strides in addressing these challenges that face America's farmers. The rule we bring before the House provides for further consideration of the underlying legislation, H.R. 2, the Agriculture and Nutrition Act, a bill that is critically important to my district in Central Washington and to rural districts just like it across the country. As a farmer myself and as a former state agricultural director, I know how important that these farm policies are when it comes to our agricultural economy. This Farm Bill strengthens the farm safety net to help America's farmers and ranchers compete. After 5 years of depressed prices and a 52% drop in farm income, our farmers need us, they need Congress to reauthorize these important programs. Mr. Speaker, while American farmers have faced these depressed prices and severe drops in farm income, we luckily have a robust safety net in place. Due to the previous 2014 Farm Bill, our agriculture community was able to hold on and continue to provide American consumers with food in our grocery stores, in our schools, and in our food banks. It is incumbent upon us to ensure these policies continue. We must pass this Farm Bill and ensure a steady food supply will be on the shelves and in our markets for the years to come. The underlying legislation includes the creation of a new international market program, which I would argue is more important today than ever before. Programs within it, including the Market Access Program and the Foreign Market Development Program, are incredibly important to producers seeking to maintain and expand their export markets for U.S. agricultural products and commodities. The Market Access Program on its own is a net positive program for which every $1 spent, $28 are returned to the American economy. I know these critical trade and export resources are at the top of the minds of American farmers and producers across the country, and we must continue to ensure their availability and access for the agricultural industry. This bill also maintains and strengthens the nation's nutrition programs to assist those who struggle to put food on the table, while providing critical training to help people attain the skills necessary to gain well-paying jobs, financial self-sufficiency, and better futures for themselves and for their families. It supports the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, without any cuts in funding. Instead, this bill adds further funding and empowers states with the flexibility on how to best administer their respective programs. The state of Washington has done innovative work in their administration of the SNAP through the BFET and the RISE programs to help some of the most vulnerable populations. And I am pleased that this Farm Bill will allow these programs to continue, if the state so chooses. This legislation contains employment and education provisions for those who need a hand up due to falling on hard times. Mr. Speaker, the Farm Bill contains comprehensive approaches to farm policy, nutrition, trade, conservation, crop insurance, regulatory reform, rural development, animal health, specialty and organic crops, and provisions to help beginning farmers and ranchers. This rule provides for further consideration of amendments offered by our colleagues in the House on a great variety of these issues. I look forward to listening to the robust debate on potential provisions to strengthen this legislation. As this is the first farm bill I've had the opportunity to engage since being in Congress, I welcome input from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and from every perspective. We must continue to bring forward solutions for America's farmers, ranchers, rural communities, and families. Mr. Speaker, this body, the People's House, is made up of many walks of life. We have physicians, we have attorneys, we have ordained ministers, we have engineers, school administrators, former state and local government officials, scientists, law enforcement officials. Today, I'm proud to come before you as a farmer. And I'm not the only one. There are maybe about 20 farmers, ranchers, and producers in the House, in the People's House. Among us are an almond farmer from Central California, a blueberry farmer from the state of Maine, a rancher from South Dakota, a cattleman from Kentucky, a rice farmer from Minnesota, and yes, a proud hops farmer from the Yakima Valley of the state of Washington. I'm privileged to come before you in support of this rule and the underlying legislation. H.R. 2, the Agriculture and Nutrition Act. I humbly urge my colleagues to support the rule, support the bill, and strengthen the future for America's farmers and all of those who depend on them. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse, for the customary 30 minutes. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I spoke yesterday about the big picture numbers behind this cruel bill, how it would cut the SNAP benefits that families rely on to buy groceries by over $20 billion. That includes slashing benefits for vulnerable adults like veterans, the chronically homeless, and teenagers aging out of foster care by $9.2 billion. There is a provision in this bill that would rip benefits away from nearly 1 million people, mostly from working families with kids, by eliminating an important state flexibility option called categorical eligibility. The bill even included a provision that would have constructed barriers to accessing SNAP for those with disabilities who have out-of-pocket utility costs. That is until Democrats shamed the majority into abandoning it as part of their manager's amendment unveiled last night. But get this fix didn't come without a cost, Mr. Speaker. Tucked into the manager's package, which was yet again written in secret, is a provision that will kick over 600,000 vulnerable adults off of SNAP in the first 2 years after enactment of this bill, 2 years before their misguided work bureaucracy goes into effect. 600,000 vulnerable men and women will lose their benefits before they even have the opportunity to take advantage of the majority's new Make Work program. Really? What are you thinking? This entire bill is an embarrassment, and this manager's amendment only makes it worse. It should be scrapped and sent back to the Agriculture Committee where we can have real bipartisan negotiations and craft a bill that actually helps people. Because despite some changes around the margins, the Republican Farm Bill remains an unmitigated disaster. Today, I want to zoom in on that big picture and give telling examples of how this disastrous Republican bill would impact real people in their everyday lives. Because that's what's at stake with the Republican Farm Bill, because that's what we need to be focused on, because it goes well beyond the numbers on a page. McClatchy reported a story earlier this month that put it succinctly, entitled 50-something food stamp recipients could face tough job search under proposed rules. Take, for example, a woman named Sabrina, who was quoted in the story. She works side jobs like cleaning houses and doing yard work, but has a difficult time finding steady employment at her age of 59. This bill will take away her benefits because she may not meet its 20-hour-per-week requirement. She's working. She's exactly the kind of person my Republican friends say they want to support. Do you think she purposely found jobs that pay so little and have so few hours? That doesn't fit so nicely into the majority's press releases, but that is the reality. Or take, for example, Thomas, a single dad who lost his wife a few years ago and is raising his preteen daughter on his own. He has worked diligently to find stable employment, but jobs are scarce in his community. Without SNAP and reduced price school meals, Thomas said he and his daughter would not be able to survive. These are the kind of people my Republican colleagues are demonizing during this debate, and it is deeply frustrating. Or Lisa, a working mother of 4 kids, earning about $14 per hour as a nursing assistant. Lisa has to stretch her monthly income to cover rent and utilities, after school care, clothing, and car costs so that she can get to her job. Currently, she receives a modest SNAP benefit to feed her family, and her kids receive free school meals. But because her income is just over the 130% threshold for a family of 5, she would automatically lose her SNAP benefits if this bill becomes law. For Lisa, SNAP makes an incredible difference in her ability to feed her children. Or Elton, a U.S. Navy veteran who lost his benefits for 2 years because of the strict work requirements and time limits that are already part of the SNAP law. During the 2-year period, he was unable to access SNAP benefits. Elton was hungry every day, wondering what he could do to eat in order to get by. And it wasn't that Elton chose not to work. He worked physically demanding jobs his entire life, but he lost his job after an injury. He continues to struggle with health conditions and doesn't have reliable access to transportation, issues that are exacerbating his job search. Under this bill, Elton may lose his modest food benefits entirely. These are real people. And if the majority on the Ag Committee actually took the time and did a hearing on the heartless nutrition title in this bill, they would have heard these and many other real-life stories. Take a moment to think about what you are doing here. My Republican colleagues are denying food benefits to veterans, single dads struggling to find work, and working moms. Why? Because Paul Ryan asked you to? Because of a myth that people aren't struggling? It's sickening. Mr. Speaker, this bill is just legislation by soundbite. Bad legislation. It demonizes the poor and trades in stereotypes, apparently just to help some in the majority with their next hit on Fox News. This bill has real consequences. It will hurt real people, our constituents, yours and mine, in every single congressional district in this country. Now, it's obvious that this isn't a serious attempt at legislating because the process here was atrocious. The majority ignored the recommendations from Democratic and Republican witnesses during the Agriculture Committee's 23 hearings on SNAP. Controversial provisions were inserted into this bill without explanation on where they came from. I asked, I still can't find out. Democrats were left in the dark as this legislation was drafted. We were left to read about it in news reports, a total affront to the bipartisan tradition that has defined the Farm Bill for years. Now, the majority may be calling this a farm bill, but it's really a total transformation of our social safety net. It's a farm bill that doesn't even improve the farm economy. And let me state, our farmers work hard. They should be valued, and they certainly deserve a hell of a lot better than what's contained in this bill. If Republicans want to hurt our workers and denigrate the poor, they're going to have to do it alone. Because make no mistake about it, that's what this bill is designed to do. And that's what it will do unless the responsible adults in the Republican Party join us in defeating it. Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the chairman of the House Ag Committee, Mr. Conaway, and I have worked together on many issues, and I know that he recognizes that the trade promotion programs that I referenced in my opening remarks are vital to our agricultural economy. For decades, USDA export development programs like MAP have helped American farmers create, expand, and maintain access to foreign markets. Throughout their history, this successful public-private partnership has cultivated hundreds of billions of dollars in exports and created millions of American jobs, both in the agricultural sector and in support industries, as well as the program brings a return to the United States economy. In the findings of the underlying bill, it states that United States export development programs significantly increased demand for United States agricultural products, generating a return of $28 in added export revenue for each invested program dollar. Additionally, our global competitors provide substantially more public support for export promotion than is provided to the United States agricultural exporters. We are at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to the rest of the world when it comes to agricultural trade. Mr. Chairman, without these private contributions and the private sector's resolve to support our export programs, it's very likely that the U.S. would not be the net agricultural exporter of the highest quality products that we are today. I think it's time that we look at our export promotion programs and take a serious look if we want to continue our exporting success. Mr. Chairman, I introduced a bill to grow the investment in the MAP and FMD programs, and I also offered an amendment that would have a smaller investment in the MAP and FMD programs. And while we are not considering those amendments today, I am grateful that Chairman Conaway has agreed to come and engage in this important issue. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the good gentleman, the House Agriculture Chairman, Mr. Conaway.
The gentleman yields, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Mr. Newhouse for his commitment to ensuring that America's farmers and ranchers maintain the tools necessary to remain competitive on a global stage. As you well know, trade is of immense importance to the agriculture industry, with U.S. agriculture exports estimated at $140 billion per year, and trade accounting for $1 in every $5 of agriculture production value. Through its extensive Farm Bill hearing series and listening sessions, the committee heard from every segment of the agriculture industry about the importance of maintaining support for our trade promotion and our market development programs, especially considering the uncertainty in the current trade climate. While I'm confident that America's farmers and ranchers are incredibly efficient and can compete with anyone in the world on a level playing field, they simply cannot be expected to compete against foreign treasuries on their own. So in addition to maintaining and strengthening the farm safety net, H.R. 2 restores and increases funding for popular and successful market access program and the foreign market development program. This was no small feat considering the CBO zeroed out funding for FMD as well as the technical assistance for specialty crops programs in its most recent baseline projections. But the committee worked together to get creative and made it happen. I certainly wish we could have come closer to answering the calls for doubling funding for MAP and FMD, but I'm proud of the work we did and believe that the streamlined International Market Development Program will give the newly established USDA Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs the tools necessary to continue tearing down barriers to trade and opening up new markets to U.S. agricultural products. That said, we can always do better, so I am committed to working with Mr. Newhouse and my colleagues in the Senate to continue searching for additional funding for these important trade promotion efforts while we move forward. And again, I'm very appreciative of Mr. Newhouse's efforts and his support for these important programs, and look forward to working with him in conference when the Senate gets their work done after we get our bill passed. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank Chairman Conaway for his commitment to continue working on this important issue, and I look forward to working with him. Mr. Speaker, at this point, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, and ask unanimous consent for him to be able to control the balance of my time.
Without objection, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized. Reserves. Sorry. And the gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as my colleague, the gentleman from Washington, is leaving, I would just urge him to read the bill. Because if he did, he would realize that if this bill were to become law, there are 60,000 people in his home state of Washington who would lose SNAP benefits just due to categorical eligibility changes alone. More would lose their benefits, but just for this one tweak in this bill. The majority of the people who would lose their benefits under categorical eligibility changes are working families with kids, children, Mr. Speaker, will lose their SNAP benefits, and many of them will lose access to free school meals. So, for all the talk about how, on the other side, about how this bill is somehow a good bill for families, read the bill. It's a pretty cruel bill for working families and for children. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask that we defeat the previous question, and if so, I will offer an amendment ensuring that before the legislation can take effect, the President must certify to Congress that none of the administration's recent trade and tariff actions and negotiations will harm U.S. farmers, ranchers, and other agriculture producers. I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record, along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
And I would like to, in order to discuss our proposal, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Illinois, a member of the Agriculture Committee, Ms. Bustos.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized. Gentleman from Washington yields. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized. The gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized. You didn't look like you're from
Unless
Georgia.
I look like a gentleman from Georgia. All right, I hope I don't. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. McGovern. I appreciate the time. Hardworking families across the heartland know firsthand what the negative impacts of trade can look like. They've lived through it in places like Galesburg, Illinois, when the Maytag plant padlocked its gates and sent every last one of those jobs to Mexico. They lived through it in Freeport, Illinois, when vulture capitalists bought out the Sensata factory and sent every last one of those jobs over to China. And today, at the end of planting season, corn growers and soybean farmers and pork producers all across the heartland are getting hit in their wallet by the Trump trade war. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, I rode in a John Deere tractor with a young soybean farmer named Jared Kunkel while he was planting his soybeans. You see, right now, as planting season is wrapping up, our farmers are making a lot of tough decisions. That's because in Illinois and many of our neighboring states, our soybean farmers sell about a quarter of their crops to China. In fact, in Illinois, if our state was its own country, we'd be the 4th largest producer of soybeans in the world. So when President Trump's thumbs got the better of him and started tweeting us into a trade war with China, there was very real consequences for the families that I serve. And to be clear, those consequences and the harm and uncertainty that they are generating is being felt right now. In fact, just this morning, there was a headline in Bloomberg News that I want to read to you. I want to show to you. It says, China buys record amount of soybeans as it shuns U.S. growers. That's this morning. The fact is our farmers have been struggling in a tightening market with low profit margins. So in 2016, when President Trump stood at a podium in Iowa and proudly declared that he would, quote, end this war on the American farmer, they took him at his word. Midwesterners do that. We believe people when they say something. And we also believe that promises ought to be kept. For farmers like Jared Kunkel of Cameron, Illinois, and thousands of farmers like him, that promise has been broken. It's been broken by this president, and now, if you do not support this amendment, it will also be broken by this Congress. So I urge you, please keep your word. Support this measure to protect our hardworking farmers and ranchers from this Trump trade war. Let's work together. And as the president says, let's end this war on the American farmer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman of Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that the gentlelady from Illinois speaks on behalf of a lot of members in this chamber. Nobody wants to see a trade war. Nobody's advantaged by a trade war. I think so many of the provisions that are in this underlying bill, Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2, are designed to create more stability for farm families. Gentlelady is absolutely right when she references the instability that trade war conversations create. So much more important then that we come together to provide that safety net and that stability that's included here in H.R. 2. I appreciate the gentlelady's encouragement that we get to the other end of these trade negotiations, and I do believe that's something that we all share. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you for yielding to me. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to one of the amendments made in order by this rule. The Foxx-Davis amendment would dramatically alter American sugar policy by eliminating the economic safety net for sugar producers. There is a Domino sugar refinery located in my district in Yonkers, New York, which has been a staple of the neighborhood for almost a century. According to their own figures, the refinery employs 280 people and sustains an additional 138 jobs through trucking, terminal operations, cargo handling, and ship piloting. That's more than 400 local jobs, most of them union jobs, supporting local families and pumping additional dollars into our community. These are the men and women I represent, and they are the ones for whom I cast my vote. With that, I will cast my vote against the Foxx-Davis amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. American sugar policy is working. It has operated at zero cost to taxpayers in 14 of the past 15 years, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture projects that sugar will run at a zero cost to taxpayers over the next 10 years. According to the International Sugar Organization, food manufacturers in the U.S. pay 10% less for sugar than other developed countries. Meanwhile, America's grocery shelf sugar prices are among the lowest in the world. And again, most importantly, the reason I rise is that the U.S. sugar industry provides good union jobs. Without the current sugar policy, 142,000 American jobs are in jeopardy of being outsourced, and the U.S. stands to lose nearly $20 billion in annual economic activity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. The gentleman just spoke about one of the amendments that's going to be offered today. And in total, there are 51 different amendments that have been made in order, both in the rule that we did yesterday and this rule that we hope that our colleagues will support today. 51 different amendments proffered by members of this chamber to try to make this bill better. If we pass this rule today, we'll be able to move to the underlying bill for consideration of those amendments. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Georgia for reminding us that there were 51 amendments made in order, but he forgot to mention that 54 were blocked. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, who's a member of the Agriculture Committee, Mr. Lawson.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise in strong opposition to the House Republican Farm Bill. I really didn't think that I would have to say the Republican Farm Bill when we worked so diligently in committee. This bill would strip our nation most vulnerable of the necessary resources they need to feed their family. The Farm Bill will bring hunger and pain to children. The bill kicks 265,000 school kids out of free and reduced lunch. And I've attended a lot of those schools where I see the kids on free and reduced lunch. Florida will be the hardest hit state resulting from the removal of categorical eligibility. In addition, 130,000 hard-working Floridians will go hungry as a result of this farm bill. The farm bill doesn't just hurt Floridians, it hurt the entire country. It hurt seniors, it hurt college students and young adults, it hurt disabled, and it even hurt other active military families. The Farm Bill also hurt rural communities. I represent several of those rural communities in North Florida and also borders those rural communities in Georgia that I received calls from. Before voting on this bill, I want to remind my colleagues of the motto of the USDA, do right, feed everyone. The Farm Bill does not do right, and it surely doesn't feed everyone. And I also caution my friends to remember, Mr. Speaker, I want to end with a quote from Isaiah 58:10.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman's recognized.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. If you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desires of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in darkness and your gloom be at noonday. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume to associate myself with the gentleman from Florida and his commitment to public service. He is a relatively new member to this chamber, but he's been fighting for his constituents since he has arrived, and I admire him for that. There are a lot of men and women in this chamber that fit that bill. Mr. Speaker, I wish we spent more time celebrating those good public service servants among us. But I have the pleasure at this time, Mr. Speaker, of yielding 5 minutes to a gentleman who fits exactly that mold. The gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin, has come time and time again to this floor, to committees, every single opportunity he has to build bipartisan support, to work together with his colleagues, to work not just on behalf of the citizens of Maine, but on behalf of all Americans. He really is a model for energy and partnership on something that everyone in this chamber would agree on. So 5 minutes to the gentleman from Maine. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield this time.
The gentleman from Maine is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for those kind words. And I would agree with you, Maine is the greatest state in the Union. I know you didn't say that, but we know you meant that. Maine, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, is the home of the most honest, hardest working people you can find anywhere in this country. We grew up in a very resilient, independent time in the state of Maine, and we cared for our neighbors and friends because it's compassionate to make sure you extend a helping hand. Mr. Speaker, my 90-year-old mother was a terrific nurse. She had a career in nursing, cared for thousands of folks in nursing homes and hospitals throughout central Maine. And my dad, who's now 88, he was a beloved 7th grade social studies teacher and a coach and a basketball official for 30 years throughout the state. I was raised in a very big-hearted Franco-American family devoted to helping others. And that's why I work so hard to make sure government does the same thing. Now, I've got some great news for folks across America that are looking to escape poverty and work their way up the ladder of independence. For 2 years, I've been pushing very hard to include job training, common sense job training, community service, and work requirements for able-bodied adults with no disabilities themselves, no young kids at home, no elderly parents they're caring for, in order to receive food stamps. We've got to be compassionate, Mr. Speaker, to help folks escape poverty instead of being trapped in government programs that has no end to it. You know, the role of government, Mr. Speaker, is not to keep folks trapped in poverty and make them, help make them comfortable living in it, but try to give them a helping hand so they can learn a job skill, get a job, and live better lives with more independence. Now, my work requirement against what the media has reported and continues to report there are no cuts to food stamps by imposing these work requirements. If the benefits are not used, because someone got a job, they're simply recycled back into job training. And again, if you're pregnant, no, I won't, thank you. And if you are pregnant or caring for young kids, or you have a disability yourself, again, you are exempt from these requirements. But if you're able to work, we need to be compassionate and require people to work to lift themselves out of poverty. Mr. Speaker, there's one other part of the Farm Bill that I'm really proud of that's included in the bill. And that's one that helps rural Maine and rural America. For the first time, locally grown fruits and vegetables can now be frozen or dried or pureed in order to qualify for school lunches and school snacks. So that means taxpayer dollars are able to buy foods that are just as nutritious as those that are fresh, save a lot of money, and make sure our kids can eat in a healthy way year-round, and it also helps our local farmers. I have one son, Mr. Speaker, who's 27, and I raised him from the time he was in diapers, and nothing was more important than making sure he had nutritious food on the table to eat. This helps us do that. So with that, I encourage everybody to vote yes for this Farm Bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the gentleman from Maine's coming here and giving a speech to the cameras, but I would suggest he read the bill. When he says that nobody will lose their benefits, no benefits will be cut from SNAP, he is wrong. The bottom line is that benefits will be cut. Benefits will be cut to support an underfunded, unproven, ridiculous excuse for a workforce and training program. And I just also should say, I hope nobody wants to emulate the state of Maine when it comes to dealing with people who are struggling in poverty and who need food. I would instruct my colleagues to read an article that appeared in the Washington Post last year about what Maine's harsh policies have resulted in. A veteran who served this country with distinction lost his job due to an injury, and because of Maine's strict work requirements, was thrown off his SNAP benefits, became homeless. He was skinning squirrels in order to be able to survive. That is not a compassionate policy that I think any state, or certainly this country, should want to reach toward. One of the things I am proud about the SNAP program is that it means that we recognize that we have an obligation to make sure that nobody in this country goes hungry. Why is that such a radical idea? Why has this program been so demonized? And when the gentleman talks about a life of dependency, read the statistics from the USDA, the average time somebody is on SNAP is less than a year. That's not a life of dependency. I'm not sure what he's talking about. Mr. Speaker, at this point, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Mr. Lauro.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
The hypocrisy of this farm bill from President Donald Trump and the Republicans in this Congress means more subsidies for the rich and greater hunger for the poor. The food stamp program is one of the most important and successful anti-hunger programs in our nation. Last year, it prevented 42.2 million people from going hungry, including 4.8 million seniors, 1.5 million low-income military veterans. And yet, my colleagues in the majority are seeking to undermine food stamps as they shield farm subsidies for the rich. You will take a look at the number of people who are the farm subsidy beneficiaries and the millions of people who are the SNAP beneficiaries. And what you want to see is how much the SNAP beneficiaries get. $1,115 per year. The farm subsidy beneficiaries, almost $10,000 a year. Farms receive more than 6 times the benefit of a person receiving food stamps, even though the vast majority of the Farm Bill beneficiaries are food stamp recipients. This Farm Bill would kick 2 million people off of food stamps, cut benefits by more than $23 billion. Meanwhile, Republicans refuse to include limits on subsidies provided for crop insurance, one of the few federal programs without any eligibility caps or payment limits. That is the untold story. Who benefits? In the Republican tax scam for the rich, 83% of the benefits went to the top 1%. The Republican Farm Bill is rigged as well for the rich. Farm subsidies, which the CBO says will cost $12.6 billion more than planned, are so skewed toward the rich that the top 10% of farms, about 76,000 farms, received over 60% of all farm subsidies. You know, SNAP recipients.
I yield the gentlelady an additional 1 minute.
A minute, thank you. SNAP recipients have income limits, asset limits. They get $1.40 per meal. Millionaires and billionaires who pocket farm subsidies do not. SNAP recipients have work requirements. Millionaires and billionaires who pocket farm subsidies do not, even though many of them do not work the land. Nearly 18,000 people in the 50 biggest cities receive farm subsidies. They do not work the land. They do not till the soil. Where are their work requirements? In fact, 23 Republican members of this Congress who vocally oppose SNAP have financial ties to farms that receive subsidies. They are poised to support this bill. They get theirs while the kids go hungry. The country needs to know this. In a land of food abundance, in the United States, no one should go hungry. The Republican Farm Bill is a massive giveaway to the rich, which will deny children in our country food. It's unspeakable. We need to eradicate hunger. We do not need to eradicate the anti-hunger programs. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. The Farm Bill is a little different this year than what we've seen in years past. We would ordinarily have more bipartisan support here on the floor. We got sideways on a couple of issues early on in the process. But the arguments that we're hearing aren't different than the arguments we traditionally hear in a farm bill, as if we're pitting those families in need of food against those families who produce the food. We're not. This bill is H.R. 2 for a reason, Mr. Speaker. A lot of folks don't understand how bill numbers get handed out in this institution. They get handed out by order of priority. H.R. 1 was the Tax Reform and Jobs Act, that bill that's brought unemployment down to the lowest levels in my lifetime and economic growth to the highest levels that we've seen in decades. H.R. 2 is the Farm Bill, because if you want to know who benefits from American farm policy, it's anybody who eats. Anybody who eats. I tell folks, Mr. Speaker, we don't need to give every child a laptop. We need to send every child on a mission trip around the globe to see how other families live, to see how other countries do it. We are so blessed in this country, and we take it for granted oftentimes. For example, I can put up charts about the distribution of farm policy until the cows come home. But the largest 15% of farms in this country produce almost 90% of all the food in this country. I'll say that again. Those folks who are doing it bigger and better than anybody else, 15% of farmers producing almost 90% of American food. Now, I'll tell you something, Mr. Speaker. We can't afford to lose those 15% of farmers. What keeps food in this country available, affordable, is a consistent farm policy, which is why, time and time again, Republicans and Democrats come together from across rural America to try to provide certainty to American agriculture. It's the largest part of the Georgia economy, Mr. Speaker, agriculture. It's true of so many districts, so many states across this land. This ought to be a partnership. It's not today, and I regret that. We're going to have opportunities to make that change going forward. But just understand, for folks who are here seeing this debate for the very first time, go back and see the Farm Bill debate from 5 years ago. You'll see the same accusations. You'll see the same recriminations. You'll see the same fear and scare tactics used. And then you'll see a huge bipartisan vote because this bill is so important to so many Americans. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the article that I referred to, for you to read, called "Trump to Poor Americans Get Work or Lose Benefits," which talks about a veteran in Maine that basically was shut out of his food benefit because of Maine's policies. I ask unanimous consent to put that on the record. And Mr. Speaker, the gentleman from Georgia just suggested we all take a mission trip around the world to see hunger and to see how lucky we are here in the United States. Well, let me tell the gentleman, you don't have to go halfway around the world to see hunger. I can take you halfway down the block, and you can see hunger right here in our nation's capital and in every congressional district in this country. There are over 41 million Americans who are hungry or food insecure in this country. We're the richest country in the history of the world. We all should be ashamed. We ought to do something about it, and this farm bill makes hunger worse. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, a distinguished member of the Agriculture Committee.
The gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for yielding me this time. I would posit to my colleague across the aisle who said that we are trying to pit farm producers against food recipients. And I believe that it is this bill that has done that. We have worked in a bipartisan manner for, I understand, years before this bill was put through without being without being discussed, without the hearings on both sides of the aisle. I try to think about what would have meant to impose the massive system of new SNAP work requirements under the bill during the time immediately after the islands were hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes. How would families submit their monthly paperwork? How would they go to jobs at businesses that were shut down? How would job slots be provided when localities must focus on providing a receipt? There's no accommodation for disaster impacted areas in this bill, and if the majority did not think of the exemptees communities, what else was overlooked in terms of reasonable standards? Unfortunately, we didn't have the opportunity to work with the majority to get answers to such key questions before this bill was unveiled and rushed through the floor. This doesn't add any help to farmers facing record low income and commodity prices, hardships due to trade retaliation, as my colleague earlier discussed from Illinois. It does not support farmer mental health or appropriate funding for broadband, tackling the opioid epidemic. This bill cuts hundreds of millions out of rural development and energy initiatives and falls short on assisting beginning, undeserved, and veteran farmers. Why? Because it is not a bipartisan bill. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. My colleague has gone through some really challenging times in her community, and this chamber has stood with her in those times. She's been a great advocate for her community in the face of some really extraordinary natural disasters. And again, we can make accusations on this floor all we'd like, but we could also spend some time bragging about those things that bring us together. There are already disaster provisions at law, disaster provisions that provide specifically disaster SNAP. For example, when communities are so hard hit, we do have these conversations, we do have these concerns for one another and our communities, and we do work together to address those concerns. We're not always successful, Mr. Speaker, but I promise you we're less successful when we don't work together than when we do. My understanding, I don't sit on the Agriculture Committee, but my friends across the aisle do, is that not a single Democratic amendment was offered in committee. It's my understanding, and again, I don't sit on the committee. I don't mind being corrected. I won't be embarrassed at all to have the record corrected. But my understanding is 5 hours of markup in the Agriculture Committee, and not one idea for improving the bill was offered. Now, that's a legitimate strategic position to take if folks want to take it, Mr. Speaker. I just don't understand it as someone who wants to get the job done and make a difference in a collaborative way on behalf of the American people. This bill is getting better every single day. It's gotten better through every conversation. As you heard my friend from Washington say in his opening statement, so many farmers with real-world experience. We heard yesterday from members who have real-world labor and workforce development experience. This bill is getting better every time. If we support the rule that we're discussing at this time, Mr. Speaker, it will make 31 additional amendments in order so that we can improve the bill even further. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Time is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I'm just trying to think of a response to the gentleman from Georgia who's trying to defend the process in the Ag Committee as somehow this bipartisan process that some of Democrats didn't want to participate. But you know what? It's just not worth it. We've been explaining it over and over and over again. This process is indefensible, and it makes a mockery of the Agriculture Committee, and it makes a mockery of this institution. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so very, very much. And I have not had the privilege to serve on the Ag Committee, but given the comments of the gentleman there, I would suggest as an amendment that since this bill is about work, that we have work for 12-year-olds. Maybe boys could be shoe shine boys and the girls could be shampoo girls at the beauty salon so that they can help subsidize families. In fact, Mr. Speaker, there's an old saying that's appropriate for this discussion. If you aren't at the table, you're on the menu. And children are definitely on the menu and at the tender mercies of the job market. This bill will cut access not only for SNAP, but kids who go to school every day. This means in my state, there'll be 23,000 kids who will not get school lunch and breakfast because of this bill. I'm going to turn in, Mr. Speaker, some of the stories of people in my district who need SNAP. Real people, single people like Jana, who's worked on a job for 11 years, lost her job, and has been looking for work for 3 months and couldn't find it. I would ask that we reject this bill for people who need SNAP to survive. This bill is not about work. It's about taking food out of the mouths of babes. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire with the gentleman for Georgia? Do you have any speakers over there, or anybody want to talk about this bill? Because we have a ton, and we just want to. You want to give us?
If the gentleman would yield.
I'm just. It's an inquiry. I don't want to take it on my time.
I'd be happy to answer the inquiry, or we could just leave it as an inquiry.
Well, as long as it doesn't come out of my time.
If the gentleman would yield, I'd be happy to answer his question.
Okay, I yield the gentleman, but it's not coming out of my time.
We do have additional speakers remaining, and of course, if we make this rule in order, if we pass this rule, we'll have 31 different amendments and speakers coming down on each one of those as well.
I'm just taking note of all the excitement on your side of the aisle on this bill. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Maine, Ms. Pingree.
Gentlewoman from Maine is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker from Maine. And thank you to my colleague, Mr. McGovern, for being kind enough to yield me the time and doing such a wonderful job on a very challenging bill. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to voice my strong opposition to the current version of the Farm Bill. There are many reasons why, among them the unrealistic challenges to food assistance programs that will have a big negative impact on my state in Maine. But what I want to focus on in my limited time is how this legislation does a disservice to the farmers and rural communities we represent. The public is very clear. They want greater access to healthy, locally grown food. They want more of it grown organically, and they want to support local farmers and rural economies. But federal policy is way behind the times, and this legislation would make it much worse. Farmers aren't ignoring the trends that consumers are asking us for. They're capitalizing them. In my state, the changing market and the demand for locally grown and organic food has reinvigorated the state's agricultural economy. Josh Gerard, who's pictured here, is one of those farmers. After earning a master's degree, working abroad in the Peace Corps, and apprenticing at local farms, Josh decided to return to his hometown to start his own farm. The small sources of federal support available to farmers like Josh pale in comparison to what commodity farmers receive. But it can make all the difference.
I yield the gentleman the additional 30 seconds.
30 seconds. For instance, Josh uses the organic cost share program to help cover the cost of certification, which helps him get more for his product. The funding for this and many other programs is endangered in this Farm Bill. Over the next 5 years, consumers will continue to change their buying habits in our food system. The question is whether the federal government would make good policy to help farmers like Josh. Ask anyone in this chamber if they support rural America, and they will say yes, absolutely. So I ask that we put our money where our mouths are. We should send the message to those keeping our farming communities alive that we believe in their potential, we value their service, and we will help them succeed by voting down this terribly partisan legislation and start over making a good bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized. Gentleman from Georgia is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, talked about how we're literally taking the food away from children. I want to make it clear to my colleagues, and there should be no mistake, this bill is going to hurt kids. First, it cuts 1 million people off of benefits through categorical eligibility changes alone. These people are working families with kids. And once these kids lose their SNAP benefits, CBO, the nonpartisan group of experts that we rely on, expects 265,000 children will lose access to free school meals. I ask my colleagues, is that what you want out of a farm bill? We can do so much better. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll yield myself such time as I may consume. Georgia's a rural state. Like so many jurisdictions represented in this chamber, sometimes you have a big city in one part of the state and the rest of the state is rural. The conversations we have in Georgia are often not Republicans against Democrats politically. It's Atlanta against the rest of the state politically, because folks often don't connect the dots between the food that they're buying on the shelf at Kroger being directly related to whether or not farmers are producing that food in the field. We've made huge strides in terms of trying to bring more fresh produce, not just into our school systems, but into our local farmers markets. Huge strides into making sure that electronic benefits aren't just able to be used at the local convenience store, but are able to be used in farmers markets so that higher quality produce can end up on families' tables. Again, Mr. Speaker, we can find disagreement in every bill that comes to the floor, but we can also find progress. There's a lot of progress in this bill. If we'll support this rule, we'll get to the underlying bill, and we'll spend the rest of the day discussing exactly that. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this point, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, and thank you for yielding. I rise in opposition to this rule and the underlying bill, which, much like the Republicans' tax measure, comforts the comfortable and afflicts the afflicted. It will have devastating impacts on SNAP recipients across the nation, including 1 in 7 in Nevada who are on this program. It will take away food assistance from some of our most vulnerable, young children, seniors, and the disabled. It will also force families to jump through extra hoops in order to access other needed benefits like assistance with their electricity bills. We can and should be doing more to lift families out of poverty and end hunger in the United States. Shamefully, this bill does just the opposite. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this point, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Sewell.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in opposition of this cruel and mean-spirited farm bill, a farm bill that will leave working families and our children out in the cold. The farm bill we're debating today cuts $23 billion from SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That would leave 2 million Americans without the support that they need to put food on the table. Mr. Speaker, I represent both rural and urban, from Birmingham to the Black Belt of Alabama, and I can say definitely that every community in my district will be worse off under this bill. For children and working families in my district, SNAP means the difference between a hot meal or going to bed hungry. For farmers and grocery stores in my district, SNAP is an investment in our food system that creates 50,000 agricultural jobs across the country. After the Republicans have shoved down a tax bill that gives the cuts to the wealthiest Americans and adds $2 trillion to our deficit, they now want to cut the benefits for hungry children and working families. I believe this is morally wrong. You see, Mr. Speaker, the face of SNAP in my district is not the welfare mother trying to get over. No, the face of SNAP in my district, where 70% of the people who are beneficiaries in my district are children. They have children under the age of 17 years old.
Time is
so the face of SNAP in America are needy children. We must and can do better. I'm going to vote no, and I urge my colleagues to do the same.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. We feel very passionately about issues on this floor. I want to give my colleague from Alabama an opportunity to retract the accusation that this is a mean-spirited and cruel bill. I know the men and women who serve on the Agriculture Committee, and they don't have a mean-spirited or cruel bone in their body. They care about farmers. They care about families. We can argue about whether or not, if you're an working aged, able-bodied, childless man in this country, whether or not we ought to try to get you a job while you're collecting federal benefits. We can talk about that. I don't think that's mean-spirited at all. I don't think that's cruel at all. I think that's exactly what we ought to be doing to lift families up out of poverty. But I would say to my colleagues, with their passion, which I know is heartfelt, feeding hungry children is a shared priority, and we see that every single day in the bills that are passed here. And we do damage. We do damage to this institution, and we do damage to the very honest and needed debates we have in this chamber when we characterize one another in ways that we know are not accurate. I know the men and women on the Agriculture Committee. I know why they chose to serve on that committee. I believe in the work they're doing. I regret that we're having this disagreement today, but we don't need to question each other's motives or integrity in order to make this debate valuable. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Kind.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank my friend for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rule and to the underlying bill because it's a missed opportunity. I had offered numerous fiscally responsible reform amendments to improve the bill, all of which were rejected last night. For instance, why is a farm entity with an adjusted gross income of over $500,000 a year still receiving taxpayer subsidies under this bill? Why can't we at least track the crop insurance premium subsidy payments to the individual entities? Right now, that is currently prohibited under the bill. That's not right. The American taxpayer deserves to see how their tax dollars are being run. Why are we eliminating the entire conservation stewardship program when 3 out of every 4 farmers applying for conservation funding assistance today are denied because of inadequacy of funds? This farm bill should be about helping our family farmers succeed, not a sop to powerful special interests here in Washington. That's why this is a missed opportunity. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, it's my pleasure to yield 3 minutes to one of my classmates from the class of 2011. We were once Budget Committee mates together back in the day. The gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in favor of the 2018 Farm Bill. Missouri farmers work hard every day to feed the world, and they need the certainty that this legislation provides. This bill strengthens safeguards for our food supply and improves public-private risk management programs that are vital to American agriculture. In addition, the Farm Bill makes significant investments in broadband infrastructure in rural America by setting a minimum speed for federal investment. This bill contains historic improvements to SNAP, which helps recipients break the cycle of poverty by improving work opportunities for able-bodied adults receiving federal nutrition assistance. This bill also promotes work and individual success while empowering those dependent on government assistance. These reforms will reduce unemployment and instill a sense of pride and work ethic by helping people move from dependency to independence and to self-sufficiency. These are common sense improvements that we're discussing today. The 2018 Farm Bill is a responsible and effective piece of legislation which maintains safety net programs and crop insurance for America's farmers while making investments in job training programs to lift those in need out of poverty. This bill has my full support, and I thank and I commend Chairman Conaway for his hard work on moving the legislation forward, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
To the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend for yielding. I'm here to speak against an amendment included in this rule, the Foxx Davis rule amendment, in defense of the 2,300 factory workers and 900 family farmers who grow sugar beets in my community. The sugar program in this country supports family farmers. The company that is formed is a co-op formed by local family-owned growers who come together, and all they ask for is a fair chance to compete, to grow their high-quality product and to not have to compete with state-subsidized foreign sugar that is dumped if we don't have a program that protects our local growers. The question is really simple. It comes down to marginally increasing the profits of large corporations or supporting family farmers who support their families by growing high-quality sugar beets and sugar cane in this country. This is a program that does not cost the taxpayers a dime, according to the CBO. It comes down to a simple question. Are we going to support our own growers, or are we going to support foreign produced sugar and marginally, and if at all, increase the corporate profits of large companies? Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I want to thank the gentleman from Michigan. He actually spent a good deal of his time just the other day in a Budget Committee hearing trying to help us get to some bipartisan solutions. He got grilled by both the Republicans and the Democrats. Everybody wanted their ounce of Michigan flesh in that day. But at the end of that conversation, and I don't say this flippantly, at the end of that conversation, I felt more optimistic about us coming together and doing some very difficult infrastructure investments in this country than I did when I walked into that room. Those things don't happen without people investing the kind of time and energy that you invested on that day and that you have invested over your career. And I want to tell the gentleman how much I appreciate that. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman is reserved. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed with an amendment, H.R. 3249, an act to authorize the Project Safe Neighborhoods Grant Program and for other purposes, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
Thank you. Mr. McGovern from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire to the gentleman how many more speakers he has left?
I would advise my friend I'm prepared to close when he is.
All right. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman's record.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I have to give credit where credit is due. This majority can't balance a budget. They can't even pass a budget. They can't fund the government without first shutting it down. They're so busy cozying up to the big banks and passing tax cuts for the wealthy that they ignore virtually every major issue facing our nation. Right now, as we speak, this Republican majority is trying to jam through a farm bill that won't even help most farmers. But the one thing this Republican majority is incredibly good at, the one thing that they do with ruthless efficiency, is stick it to poor people. This majority is Robin Hood in reverse. They are master legislators for the mega wealthy. Well, they might want this chamber to look out solely for those at the top, giving them more tax breaks, making it easier for them to pollute our planet, and systematically attacking the safeguards we put in place to stop another financial collapse. But while they work with unflagging, unshakable, dogged determination to give a helping hand to the fat cats, they tell those struggling to get by, those begging for opportunity at a living wage, that they should just work harder. Never mind that they didn't grow up in nice neighborhoods, in a stable home with good nutrition and a quality education. Maybe they started off in life having to play catch-up. Maybe they need just a little help from their government to make the American dream a reality in their life. Or maybe they were born with advantages, but they have fallen on hard times and they need a little bit of help. I'm standing here today, Democrats are standing here today, giving a voice to our workers, the middle class, and those trying to break into the middle class. And if my Republican friends actually listen to their voices, they would join us and vote against this monstrosity of a bill that attacks working American citizens and takes lunch money away from children. It is disgusting, Mr. Speaker. Now, I urge a no vote on the previous question, the rule, and I urge all of you, no, I plead with all of you, to vote no on this bill. You know, I grew up in a family where helping those who are struggling was the right thing to do, the decent thing to do. Please, please send this bill back to committee. Surely we can do better. Let's demonstrate to the American people that we are here to help, that we care, that we are decent. You know, the gentleman from Georgia, commented that we're all so emotional on this side of the aisle when we're debating this issue. You're damn right we are. We are emotional. We're angry. We're frustrated because people are going to be hurt. If you have ever met a hungry child, it should break your heart. And there are millions and millions in this country who are hungry. We are the greatest country in the history of the world, the richest country in the history of the world, and tens of millions of our fellow citizens are food insecure or hungry. Why isn't that a priority? Why isn't that a bigger priority than another tax cut for a big corporation? I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle deep down inside care about those who suffer in this country. Well, here's an opportunity to prove it. Let's do a farm bill that actually doesn't make hunger worse in this country. I'm not even asking you to eliminate hunger, although I wish that were a priority. I'm just saying don't make it worse. This bill will throw millions of people off of a food benefit, and millions of children will be impacted. And they're not just people who aren't working. You know better than that. Many of these people are working families, people who are working hard but can't make ends meet. You're taking away a food benefit. I mean, what's wrong with this institution?
Gentleman's time has
We can do
expired.
better. Mr. Speaker, vote no on this rule and vote no on this bill.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire how much time is remaining?
Gentleman has 3.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of the time. I want to thank my friends on the Ag Committee for the work they did on this bill. It's not easy to do big pieces of legislation. We do a farm bill every 5 years. It's always a hard thing to do, and my friends on the Ag Committee have taken the slings and arrows. You've heard the accusations that have been made just here on the floor today. The unemployment rate in this country, Mr. Speaker, is as low as it's ever been in my lifetime. And the number of childless working-age men who are sitting it out is as high as it's ever been in my lifetime. Now, we can argue about how to care about people more. We can argue about how to love people more. But I would tell you, helping someone to find a job matters. And historically, Mr. Speaker, it's one of those things we agree on. For whatever reason, we've made it the topic of something we're going to pretend to disagree on today. More jobs available in this country than ever before. I think we owe it to families who haven't been able to connect themselves with that job market to help them to do better. Mr. Speaker, so often we talk about all the lawyers in Congress, all the lawyers who are bureaucrats, all the folks who are working on policies that they just don't understand. I want to close with where my colleague from Washington State began. Of course, he's a former ag commissioner from Washington State, and he said this. He said he's not the only farmer in this House. There are 20 farmers, ranchers, and producers serving here in the People's House. An almond farmer from Central California, a blueberry farmer from Maine, a rancher from South Dakota, a cattleman from Kentucky, a rice farmer from Minnesota, and a hops farmer from the Yakima Valley in Washington State. Mr. Speaker, this body really does reflect working Americans, folks out there trying to be the breadbasket to the world, trying to put fresh produce on the shelves for every American family to benefit from. This bill continues our commitment to serving the hungry, and it continues our commitment to being the finest agricultural production nation that this planet has ever seen. Vote yes on this rule. Let's consider some amendments to make this bill even better, and then let's send it to the Senate and give the American people a bill they can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, with that, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question.
Gentleman yields. The question is on ordering the previous question of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question will be followed by 5-minute votes on adopting the resolution, if ordered, and agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal, if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 228 and the nays are 189. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman requests the yeas and nays?
I do.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 228 and the nays are 188. The resolution is adopted without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.